Hello and welcome to EVA India Insights podcast. I'm Pallavi, your host for today, and in this episode, we're discussing why data breach response in the BFSI sector has moved beyond IT and has become a board level governance issue. With the rising regulatory expectations and how organizations respond to a breach now defines trust, accountability, and outcomes. Joining us is Ranjit Bellari, partner of Forensic and Integrity Services at EVA India, to share what boards and leaders must get right when a breach occurs. Hi Ranjit, a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you, Pallavi.
Yes, Ranjit. So to begin with, Ranjit, why has the data breach response in the BFSI shifted from the technical IT issue to a board critical governance and regulatory risk under the India's DPDP framework?
Sure, I think it's a very relevant question for BFSI companies today because when you look at the regulatory accountability that DPDP expects, because whenever a breach happens, the direct impacts is on customer trust. It's on fiduciary responsibility. It could be business continuity. So I think that's where it has moved from a simple IT incident to more on governance, privacy, conduct, and regulatory accountability for a lot of organizations. Now, under DPDP, a personal data breach must be notified to the Data Protection Board and also to the impacted individuals. And what we've seen is that DPDP analysis ensures that a detailed board report is required within 72 hours, and failure to notify can attract penalties up to INR 200 crores, which I think is a huge amount for any organization. So I think the board is no longer asking only where we attacked, right? They should also be asking, did we respond lawfully, quickly, transparently, and with the right evidence? And I think that's where the regulators are looking for the right kind of reporting from an organization standpoint. And I think not just RBI, but I think different regulatory authorities are treating this as a board level matter. And that's where I think cybersecurity, incident response, recovery management, and cyber crisis management policies must be approved and reviewed by the board.
Thank you, Ranjit. Now, building on the previous question, the first 72 hours of the breach are often decisive. So, what decisions during this window most strongly influences the regulatory, financial, and the reputational outcomes for the banks and the insurers?
So I'll try and deal on some of the top important decisions that organizations need to look at. Right, first is classification. Whether this is only a cyber incident or is also a personal data breach. That will determine the regulatory reporting you need to do to different authorities, like to the DPDP board whenever it is formed, to certain, to RBI. From an insurance standpoint, it needs to go to the Insurance Regulatory and Development Authority of India. For customers, or it could be law enforcement and also could be contractual obligations if there's a third party breach. Second is containment without destroying evidence. Now, what we've seen is organizations shut their systems once they detect a breach. But from a forensic standpoint, that could do more harm because a lot of volatile evidence gets lost in this process. The better decision is controlled containment, where the systems could be preserved for a forensic imaging and the preservation of the relevant logs and chain of custody. Third is the notification strategy. So DPDP requires affected individuals and the board to be informed without delay with a detailed report to the board within 72 hours. Certain also requires specific cyber incidents to be reported within 6 hours of noticing them, right? So having the right notification strategy is very important. And finally, I think the last decision is the customer protection. Like, for example, for a bank or an insurer, the response should include account monitoring, card blocking, fraud watch lists, call center scripts, and clear customer advisories. So, for example, if I can give another quick example, let's say there's a customer KYC records that got exfiltrated. The question is not just whether the database was patched. The decisive questions are also who is affected, what data elements were exposed, what fraud risk arises, what customers should do, and what evidence supports our conclusion.
Thank you, Ranjit. Now, from a regulatory lens, how are regulators today assessing the quality of breach response, especially in terms of evidence, documentation, and the decision discipline, rather than just the existence of cybersecurity controls?
Sure. See, from a regulator standpoint, regulators are increasingly looking beyond whether controls existed before the incident. They are more looking for the decision discipline from the organizations. Like, for example, can the institution prove what happened? When it knew, who decided? Why the decision was made, or whether the decision made was reasonable, and what was done to protect their customers. Right. Some of these aspects is what the regulators are increasingly going to look for. Not just from an India standpoint, I think globally also that's what majority of the regulators are looking for. Right. Now, obviously, evidence matters. Like, for example, logs, endpoint telemetry, access records, data flow maps, meeting notes, legal privilege protocols, notification drafts, customer impact assessments. All of this matters. Now, from RBI's standpoints, RBI's IT governance direction requires clear escalation and reporting plans to the board, senior management, customers, certain, etc., etc. Now, it also requires forensic analysis where necessary to determine severity, impact, and root cause. So I think in a breach investigation, absence of evidence can look like absence of governance.
Thank you, Ranjit. Now, what role does the forensic readiness, including the early triage and evidence preservation, play in creating a very defensible breach response for the BFSI organizations?
Sure. So, from a forensic readiness standpoint, forensic readiness means pre-agreed incident playbooks, preserved logs, endpoint visibility, cloud audit trails, privileged access records, the right, sort of controls that were enabled within the different systems to ensure that a forensic can happen, and obviously a well-trained, forensic and crisis team. These are some of the elements, that's what forensic readiness means, right? RBI expects, regulated entities to analyze cyber incidents, including through forensic analysis, if necessary, for severity, for impact, and for root cause, right? Like, for example, a bank that has 180 days of usable logs, synchronized timestamps, and mapped customer data repositories can produce a defensible breach report in quick time, right? And a bank that starts searching for logs after the breach is already running against time. So I think forensic readiness plays a very important role for organizations, not only to reduce the cost of doing an analysis or a investigation post an incident, but also to ensure that they are timely reporting to the regulatory authorities, not just regulatory authorities, to their customers, to their internal employees if any of that breach involves employee data. So I think forensic readiness is hugely helpful in that aspect.
Thank you, Ranjit. Now, finally, from a board level perspective, what does the effective breach preparedness look like today, particularly when you're factoring third party risk, cross functional coordination, and accountability under pressure?
So, from a board's perspective, preparedness, I would say, majorly has 5 elements. The first is accountability, right? So, majorly, who's accountable? Who is the executive owner across, whether it's the CISO, whether it's a CIO, whether it's a DPO or a legal head or a compliance head or a risk head, right? I think that becomes very, very important in terms of who is accountable for different aspects of especially when dealing with a crisis or a data breach. Second is third party, right? Usually organizations deal with a lot of third parties, so contracts must require immediate breach notification, audit rights, log access, evidence preservation, and cooperation. RBI specifically expects a vendor risk controls to address legal or regulatory compliance, from a customer data protection standpoint, from an availability standpoint, and from a supply chain risk standpoint. Thirdly, I think crisis, management. Oftentimes, we've seen organizations spend a lot on proactively trying to address, cyber risks, other risks. However, when it comes to, let's say, an incident happens, very little emphasis is there on how quickly they can detect, how quickly they can respond, and respond in the right way. And I think that's where crisis management and tabletop exercises, becomes hugely important. So tabletop simulations involving not just the IT or other teams, but it should also involve the senior stakeholders like the CEO, the board, etc. That's very important. Fourth is regulatory readiness, right? And obviously, we've discussed this. The team should know, what must be reported, to whom it must be reported within the stipulated timeline. Because today, a typical, BFSI organization is looking at multiple regulators to which they need to report to, depending on the kind of business they operate in. So I think regulatory readiness is very, very important. And lastly, I think a customer first response, I think, is very, very important. Eventually, regulators are looking at the accountability of the organizations from their customer standpoint. So the board, should test whether communications are clear, factual, and protective rather than defensive. So these are the five elements that I would say it's important for board to look at from a preparedness standpoint.
Thank you, Ranjit. And that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you so much once again for joining us and sharing all your perspectives to all our listeners.
Thank you, Pallavi.
Thank you. And our key takeaway from today's conversation is cyber resilience today is not just about prevention, it's about readiness, decision making, and credibility under pressure. And for BFSI boards, breach response has become a core governance capability. Thanks all for tuning in for the EY India Insights podcast. We look forward to sharing more perspectives that help leaders build trust and resilience. Until next time, this is Pallavi signing off.